Researchers sampled the monkey's brain signals every 30 milliseconds, giving them about 33 snapshots per second of the monkey's neural activity. It took the algorithm and robot arm about 150 milliseconds to transform each neural impulse into an arm command, which is at about the lag time of a biologically intact nervous system. In essence, Schwartz and his colleagues had given the animals instantaneous and uninterrupted control of the arm. Nowhere was this more apparent than in a second video when a researcher moves a piece of food away as the monkey is in mid-reach. The animal quickly changes course, grabs the marshmallow, and takes a bite. In a third video, the monkey only partially takes a marshmallow into its mouth. With its biological arms restrained, it holds the marshmallow in its lip, using the pincer to push the treat all the way into its mouth. It wasn't making a roadie stereotypical movements. It was freestyling. Of course, a biologically intact person continually adjusts her movements to better adapt to the shifting environment. By that measure, the monkey's movements are banal. But that's really the point, a smooth, naturalistic movement that approaches its biological analog. The monkey was coming to embody the robot arm, its neurons spontaneously adjusting to better achieve the task at hand. At that moment, Schwartz's monkeys were doing something not so different from what a baby does when she learns to walk or from when a child learns to throw a ball. But while biological coordination improves as pathways between neurons are streamlined and strengthened, the neurons here were changing their behavior to better control the non-biological arm. They were adapting to the interface. Meanwhile, Schwartz had used lessons from his earlier days with Georgopoulos to craft a relatively simple algorithm that could recalibrate to accommodate the dynamic neural interface. It's important to realize that we have a model. Our model is far from perfect in describing what really goes on in the brain, he said. But what we've been incredibly successful at is extracting movement and intention by using this very simple algorithm. The resulting paper, published in 2008, was a watershed moment for the lab. CBS's 60 Minutes came calling. The study landed on the front page of the New York Times and was subsequently picked up by the countless other news organizations. No one had ever shown such elegant neural control. Schwartz had clearly knocked it out of the park, and his lab was inundated with interview requests. It was a gratifying moment for Schwartz, but not a comfortable one for a guy who's more interested in the science than in the demo. I hated it. I could never express what I wanted to express. All I could say is self-feeding. Yeah, they can grasp pieces of food and bring it into their mouth, he said. You end up telling the same damn thing over and over. Still, Schwartz was undeniably proud of work. He'd shown proof of principle. Not only could a monkey gain elegant and continuous control over a robot arm, but it could also use it as a worthy surrogate of its biological counterpart to perform an essential task. The whiz-bang factor of BCI kept the public interested and, importantly, the cash flowing, but it was the underlying science that most excited Schwartz. Brain-computer interfaces were pointing to some foundational principles of brain function. They were telling him things about how the brain learns, its relationships to objects, even thought self. I always laugh about psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists who say they're going to study cognition or thinking. I say, can you define that for me? If I were going to poke one of my electrodes in the brain and find a thought, how would I know if I found it? He said. They can't define it. They can't even define the necessary parameters of thought. So how am I supposed to find it? What Schwartz had developed, by contrast, was a closed input-output system he could use to test the accuracy of his model. We can prove how well it works because we can look at the movement or the performance. You can't do that if you say, oh, thought takes some electricity and some chemicals. Where's your model? He said. But I can say, well, based on my model, my hypothesis, my subject can do this. The self-feeding task didn't give Schwartz a way to explore the more fundamental questions of how the brain generates neural code or why a motor neuron changes its activity pattern. What it did give him, however, was a way to observe the brain as it shifted those patterns of activity. Simply stated, an individual motor neuron will fire more rapidly when initiating movement in a preferred direction. The farther the intended movement is away from an individual neuron's preferred direction, the more slowly that neuron will fire. It was combining the firing patterns of a population of individual neurons, a population vector, that Georgia Paloulos' lab first accurately anticipated movement. The field has been working with that model since the mid-1980s, but one of the features Schwartz and others have highlighted since its tendency of neurons to shift their preferred firing directions to better accommodate external modalities such as robot arms. The key tenet of neuroplasticity is that brain reorganizes itself by creating fresh synaptic connections between neurons. By forming connections between cells, neurons wire together. Their activity becomes more closely associated. When one wired neuron fires, a small pulse of electricity courses through the cell body to where it forms synaptic connections with other cells. The pulse of electricity causes the cell to release chemicals known as neurotransmitters into the gaps separating one cell from another, a synaptic connection. Each of the brain's estimated 100 billion neurons is synaptically connected to an estimated 10,000 other neurons. At any given moment, an individual neuron may be receiving inputs in the form of neurotransmitters from thousands of neighboring cells, each coaxing it to produce or withhold an action potential. Once the receiving neuron reaches an informational threshold, it will produce an action potential of its own, releasing still more electrochemical signals to nearby neurons, each of which is receiving inputs from thousands of other cells. No one knows for certain what the tipping point is for a neuron to fire. It is an accretion of inputs from thousands of nearby neurons. Are there certain neurons whose activities are so intimately bound that when one fires, the other does as well? Do some neurons have more influence than others? Are they equal? No one really knows. Nevertheless, new synaptic connections are critical. It is a physical alteration of the brain's physiology to produce new behaviors. Said differently, it is physical processes of learning. We learn new behaviors or skills by altering our brain's activity and physical landscape, and these challenging synaptic connections are the fundamental building blocks of that process. And yet no one understands the underlying mechanism of this process. Everybody talks about synapses changing their efficacy, that they're plastic and that their synaptic efficacy changes, but that's not a model. That's not showing you that this happens and then this happens and I will get a result, said Schwartz. But with BCI, we can do that. We can actually make a subject learn. Schwartz can induce changes in how the brain behaves. I can explicitly force you to change the way your neurons fire. By altering the output algorithm that controls the arm, Schwartz can make a neuron whose activity is normally associated with, say, moving the arm up and to the right initiated a movement in another direction. Faced with such a contradictory output, neurons in motor cortex will actually change their directional tuning to accommodate the new paradigm. That is much closer to the way learning really takes place in the brain than trying to understand how some neurotransmitter changes a little bit or how a protein changes. I can't tell you how a neuron changes its tuning function, but I can tell you certain ways that it changes its tuning function. DARPA was more interested in results than in Schwartz's basic findings, but the motor control he exhibited meant he was on the inside track to humans. Not long after he published the 2008 paper, Kaigan Gabriel, then the acting head of DARPA, called asking to visit Schwartz's lab. APL had already produced 2 prototype arms, but direct cortical command was a long way off. They had 30 or 40 labs, but they didn't know what they were doing, Schwartz recalled. I was out of that role revolutionizing prosthetics thing. But with the results I was getting, my little lab by myself, we got all these results that nobody else was getting. When Gabriel touched down in Pittsburgh, Schwartz gave him the grand tour. He showcased the monkey lab and the self-feeding experiments. They spent all this money and they really didn't have anything, said Schwartz. But for me, this is my career. This is my life. Schwartz squired the DARPA head across town, where his department chair, Michael Boninger, gave him a tour of his wheelchair lab for spinal cord injury patients. He knew he had this capability, Schwartz said. We could do this stuff. Gabriel was impressed, and by the end of the visit, he floated the idea that Pittsburgh might join the revolutionizing prosthetics program. I'm going, whoa. By then, Donahue had already been working for humans for years. Schwartz had made tremendous progress in monkeys, but he was getting impatient. He needed to get into humans fast. For the past few years, his former postdoc, Dan Morin, had been working in St. Louis, where, along with Eric Ludhart, he had been pioneering an ECOG-based brain-computer interface. Moran had been proselytizing about ECOG's potential ever since he and Ludhart first hatched the idea. But Schwartz was skeptical. He was a purist. He loved the clarity of a single neuron, and ECOG seemed muddy. You don't have enough information coming out of that signal, said Schwartz. The resolution is just too low to get the details you want. But Moran, Ludhart, and their collaborators had forged ahead, publishing a string of promising results. Flush with this success, Moran was now visiting his mentor in Pittsburgh. When I told Annie that Eric and I were going to start doing ECOG back in 2003, he said, "What the hell are you doing wasting your time with that crap for?" said Moran. But it was a great way for him to get the infrastructure for human experiments. I think he realized ECOG is safe so he can get into human patients. It's more pragmatic. Pragmatic? More like quick and dirty. Unlike the penetrating electrodes Donahue had pushed through an onerous FDA approval process, ECOG grids were already in the wide clinical use. The FDA didn't need to be involved. All Schwartz and his department chair, Michael Boninger, needed to get up and running on a human ECOG trial was approval from the school's institutional review board. I'm thinking I've got to do human stuff, said Schwartz. We're talking, and Mike said, why can't we start with epilepsy just like you guys are doing in St. Louis? I wasn't super excited about it, to tell you the truth. I looked at it as infrastructure. ECOG would let him start working in humans immediately, but what he really needed was to sink his penetrating electrodes to the human motor cortex. Why can't we do that? Boninger recalled, asking over a beer. We were talking and Andy said, man, if I could just get these arrays in someone, I could get them to play the piano. The summer of 2004 was a sort of golden moment for Tim Hemez. It had been a few years since he tabled his high school dream of playing professional hockey. Now 23, he planned to marry the mother of his 18-month-old daughter. His fledgling auto detailing business had survived its first winter. Business was starting to pick up, and he'd work out agreements with several used car lots around town to refurbish vehicles they bought at auction. He was making good money for the first time in his life. The business was booked solid for a month. He'd even hired a few new employees. His girlfriend was studying to become a nurse, and they'd started talking about wedding dates. They were on the market for a house. And he just bought his first motorcycle, a blue and white Suzuki GSX-R 750. a beast of a bike that topped out at 171 miles per hour. It even adopted a new pit bull puppy that he'd named Neo after Keanu Reeves' character in The Matrix. Jemez had always hoped to get out of the small towns around Butler, Pennsylvania, but the place had a way of sucking you in. He hadn't even had the grades to go to a good college, and now that his NHL dreams hadn't panned out, Butler didn't seem so bad. He was starting to think about his 5-year plan. He was even starting to think about his 10-year plan. It wasn't what he imagined, but his life was coming together on a sunny day like July 11, 2004. His future seemed clear, bright, and untroubled. It was one of those Sundays when Jimenez had several plans in the air. He had talked about spending the day in Pittsburgh, grabbing a bite to eat, and touring around town. There was also a concert that night, but his girlfriend's sister had wanted them to babysit her son, so they instead loaded up the car and headed to the park. The temperature was on the gentle side of summer, a slight wind and not a cloud in the sky. And when they arrived at the park, Jemez found his 6'2" frame onto a bench to watch his daughter run around with their new puppy. That was my day, he said. Everything I could have asked for. They fixed something to eat when they arrived home, but it was a gorgeous night, and Jemez was restless to take his bike for a ride. He loves its lines and its power. Though he'd only had the motorcycle for a few months, he'd already put more than 2,000 miles on it. His friends had cautioned him against getting such a bike his first time around, but that had never made sense to him. He wanted a big bike. He already knew how to ride. He also knew himself well enough to know that if he bought a smaller bike, he'd just end up buying a bigger one a few months down the road. Why waste money? The bike's slogan was, "Own the racetrack." But Jimenez wasn't looking for a speed that night. He just wanted the summer wind in his face, and as he cruised the two-lane blacktops outside Butler. Dressed only in a pair of jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt, he was caught short when he pulled out of the garage. "Wear your helmet," a voice said, prompting him to turn the bike off and head back to the garage. It was around 10:40. Jemez had been traveling these roads his entire life. He wasn't going more than 20 miles per hour, but when a deer jumped in front of him, he swerved hard to hitting the right, hitting a patch of gravel. He touched his brakes, trying to pull out, but the pebbles were like ice. Jemez was skating on two wheels, gripping hard on the handlebars as his careered toward a mailbox by the guardrail. The bike was still in first gear, but Jemez hit the mailbox with such a force that he pulled its post from the ground. The impact snapped his right scapula in two. As he fell back, he twisted the throttle, unleashing the engine's 83 Newton meters of torque. The bike reared on its back wheel. It jammed its tailpiece into the ground with such force that it kicked back like a donkey, popping upright and launching him over the handlebars. Jemez awoke in a hospital 3 days later. He had a tube up each nostril and one down his throat. His feet were elevated. His head was low, and the room was sweltering from all the heart monitors and ventilators whose beeps and chimes and dings filled the chamber. I'm thinking, why am I in this room? There was no one there to explain, he recalled. And he tried to scratch his nose. I was lifting my arm. I could feel it in my mind moving, he said, but it wouldn't move. I had no idea why. The accident shattered Jemez's fourth cervical vertebrae, severing his spinal cord and leaving him paralyzed below the neck. There were no bones, no anything supporting my head, just the meat and the tissue, he said. I was literally a bobblehead. Doctors tried to stabilize the spine, but his C4 vertebrae had turned to dust. They ended up plucking bone fragments from his neck and planting a bone from and using rods to fuse his cervical spine from the third to the sixth vertebrae. Through it all, Jemez refused to believe he was paralyzed. He told himself he was on vacation, just lying in bed watching television. That's what I had set in my mind. You know, I work very hard, and this is going to heal itself, he said. It may take 6 months, it may take a year, but I was on vacation. Still, the ventilator tube made it hard for him to talk, so his family wrote out an alphabet on a piece of paper. They would run a finger over the letters. He would nod yes to spell out words. This sucks, he spelled out one day when his girlfriend came to visit. She asked him what he meant. I want to write something, he spelled. He couldn't, she told him. He couldn't hold a pen. He nodded yes. Yes, he could write. No, you can't, Tim, he remembered her saying. You're paralyzed. She placed a piece of paper on the bed beside him and placed a pencil between his fingers. Amesh tried to grasp it, but the pencil fell to the floor. She picked it up and again placed it in his hand. Once again, it dropped to the floor. Then it finally hit me, he said. Amez's muscles atrophied in the coming months. He wasn't eating. He dropped to a mere 150 pounds as he grew increasingly despondent. He might have remained that way if he hadn't seen a TV show about an experimental stem cell treatment in Portugal. She was walking, Jemez recalled of the patient. My mother hadn't seen the segment, but when she came back in the room, I kept saying, I need to go to Portugal. I need to go to Portugal. Jemez never did go. The clinic only harvested a small number of stem cells, and his injuries were simply too severe. He kept hunting, though, and in November 2006, he underwent a similar treatment in Mexico, where doctors removed a band of scar tissue around his injury before implanting some 2 million embryonic stem cells, an experimental treatment not approved by U.S. regulators. Amez emerged hopeful from the procedure. The surgeon told him the operation had been a success. Amez recalled that the doctor said he'd found 40% of the spinal cord still intact. Scar tissue had been choking it off like a tourniquet. And once he removed the constricting tissue, the cord immediately turned back to the right color and started to pulsate like normal. Amez spent his 26th birthday at the Mexican clinic, where doctors treated him like a friend, giving him birthday gifts, buying him beer, pizza, and cigarettes, while nurses stayed up late with him watching Italian films and brought him a slice of double chocolate cake. He was buoyed a few days after surgery when one of the doctors injected him with antibiotics. Amez couldn't believe it. He hadn't felt anything below his neck in more than 2 years, but he immediately felt a sharp burning sensation. No way am I feeling this injection, he thought. But when I looked down, right where it was burning, he was giving me my shot. The doctor then removed the needle. Amez recalled and said, You will walk again. Amez never did walk again, but that was never really the point. It was a fantasy, he said. I'm not looking to walk out of these places. I'm looking for a little bit of recovery. What a lot of people don't understand with spinal cord injury is that if I could just move my little finger, that would change my world. Amez had put in the hard work. He'd gone to physical therapy. He'd tried alternative treatments and even traveled abroad for experimental procedures. It was time to accept his injury. It was time to concentrate on building a life and raising his daughter. Nevertheless, he continued to read up on experimental treatments and research. He signed up as a potential research subject at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He was also talking to researchers in Cleveland who, for the past 3 decades, have been developing a technology known as functional electrical stimulation, or FES, which uses electrodes implanted in the body's peripheral nervous system to reanimate paralyzed limbs. By then, Schwartz and his colleagues were looking for human research subjects for an ECOG study that would be headed by a young researcher named Y. Wing. When they were telling me about how I'd be able to move a robotic arm and a cursor on a computer screen, they told me it would be no direct benefit to me, but that it was going to be the foundation for something bigger, he said. Knowing my luck, I'd say to the Pittsburgh study, and that's when Cleveland would call, and there was my opportunity for FES out the window. Amez said no to Pittsburgh, but a few days later, the researchers called again. They'd spoken with Cleveland. They told him there might be an opportunity years down the road to combine an implanted wireless neuroprosthetic with a wireless FES. system. He wouldn't be just controlling robotic limbs, he would be able to use his own. Now you got my ears open, he said. I would be their guinea pig for the next 5, 10 or 15 years. I'll do whatever surgery needs to be done, but when that time comes and we do complete the wireless system, I want to keep it. You can't take it out of me. In the late summer of 2011, Hamez became the first human subject to receive an ECOG implant outside an epilepsy monitoring setting. Hamez would have the implant for no more than 28 days. Time was short, and a mere 2 days after surgery, Wang and his fellow researchers arrived at Hamez's home to connect his brain to a computer. Surgeons had slid an implant below the dura mater and then routed the connecting wires down his neck to his chest, where the cables excited his body and connected to an amplifier. His head was pounding, stitches still bound and the incision, but on that first day of testing, Wang and Hamez worked to gain two-dimensional control over the cursor. Unlike Luthard and Moran, who asked their human research subjects to imagine distinct physical gestures like making a fist to move the cursor to the right, Wang first asked Hamez to imagine moving his arm naturalistically to control the cursor. They kind of left it up to me, he said. If I wanted to go up, I would think lift my arm up. If I wanted to go down, I would think swing it down. Left, right, all the same thing. The grid's electrodes were each listening in on different groups of neurons, meaning theoretically that the implant could provide nearly 30 independent output channels. That would provide ample information to gain control of a cursor. Still, Wang was nervous. He realistically had only a few weeks to work with Hamez, Wang, an assistant professor heading a closely watched study needing results. Very stressful was how he recalled the month-long experiment. It's almost like a space mission. You prepare all these things up to a point, but then you launch the thing and you only have a certain amount of days to complete the mission. Wang wanted to demonstrate sound three-dimensional control of human. By then, Luthard and his colleagues had already shown two-dimensional control, but that time was running out, and Wang discarded naturalistic yet but more complicated approach of asking Hamez to imagine moving his arm to the left or right. They asked him instead to imagine unrelated actions to move the cursor. Hamez would think of moving his thumb to send the cursor to the left. He'd imagine flexing his elbow if he wanted to move it to the right. Imagining moving both the thumb and the elbow sent the cursor skyward, and so on. Not only did the system enable Hermes to move the cursor in 3 dimensions, but by modulating the speed of imagined movement, Hermes could simultaneously adjust the cursor's velocity, eventually reaching 80% success rate. It was no mean feat. Hamez had to remember and coordinate 6 unrelated actions to control the cursor in just 3 dimensions. I'm trying to get up to the top corner, he said. I'm trying to move my thumb just a little bit. Because if I do too much, it's going to fly backwards while I'm trying to lift my arm while trying to make my fist. There was a lot going on. It was a cumbersome system, and Hermes relied on the skills he developed as a hockey goalie, keeping his eye on the puck while paying attention to other players on the ice. You're always making those calculations, he said. It's the same with this. There are so many different things going on at once. Even so, this sort of system known as a classifier seemed inherently limited. It's so hard to imagine that a person could gain much more than basic 3-dimensional control using a system of imagined gestures to enact unrelated movements. The current study was limited by the relatively arbitrary association between attempted movement and desired cursor movement direction. Wang noted in PLOS 1, the online scientific journal, where he eventually published his findings, it was worth investigating BCI control schemes based on natural neural representation of intended movement in ECOG signals. Worth it? For Schwartz, it was an absolute necessary. If neuroprosthesis were ever to become truly useful, they'd have to use an intuitive form of control, A classifier was a quick way to gain simple control, but it would ultimately become a limitation that prevented more complicated and spontaneous control, which soured Schwartz on potential effectiveness and scientific relevance of ECOG. Every time I see Way, I say that's bullshit, he said. That's a classifier. You don't need to know anything about how the brain works other than the fact that the guy that tells you what you tell him to do, you can make those neurons fire. Schwartz argued that because a classifier relies on a limited collection of arbitrary gestures, it would never allow a person to move creatively and spontaneously. A user would instead be stuck with a handful of rote actions, and there was no guarantee he or she could extrapolate subtle movements that fell outside that limited vocabulary. I kept telling them this was not the way to do it, Schwartz said. It's an engineering shortcut. They're doing engineering without a foundation in science. Nevertheless, on the final day of the study, Wang hooked Hermes up to a robotic arm. With cameras rolling, Hermes used the arm to reach out and give Wang a high five. He was able to go to him, Hermes said. That was the first time in a little over 7 years that I was able to interact with another human being in that way. As impressive as Hermes' feat was, he couldn't have achieved it without the latest version of APL's modular prosthetic limb, a technological marvel that boasted 26 degrees of freedom and sensors to transmit sensory information to the wearer. Still, to fully exploit the arm's potential, researchers would have to link it to the central nervous system. That meant DARPA had to find a scientist with research know-how to control the arm. That meant DARPA needed Schwartz. I said this is what we're going to do. Boom, 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 Schwartz recalled. This is exactly what I wanted to do, and it takes a guy like me to make it work. It's like, I don't give a shit if you give me money or not. I'm going to make the damn thing work, and that's what it takes. Once Jeffrey Ling saw Schwartz's proposal, the choice seemed clear. He totally understood what he wanted to achieve, said Ling. Because of who he is and the people he has working with him, he was clearly the person.